Mr. Trump said he was going to end the war in 24 hours. Well, he didn't put forward a proposal to do that. Now he says he wants to do it in 100 days. Where's the proposal? And, if the proposal does not address the key issues of concern to Moscow, it will be dead on arrival. And there apparently have been some sort of back channel discussions going on with the Russians. I don't have any information on that at all, but there's certainly many rumors that has been happening. So perhaps General Kellogg does have a sense from the Russians of what is required to end the war. But there's no evidence of that so far in public statements. And to remind it, the Russians have been consistent from the beginning. They want a guarantee that Ukraine will not be in NATO, that it will return to the neutrality in which it was born. They want guarantees for a Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine, those that have not been annexed in the 4 oblasts that the Russians have taken, and 3 of which are only partially occupied, one of which is fully under Russian control. They demand that they keep those oblasts in order to protect the Russian speakers there who were being persecuted and attacked by the Ukrainian nationalists. Here, too, I would say it's very interesting. Russia has never objected to the idea of Ukraine joining the European Union. I think there are probably 2 reasons for that. That for Ukraine to join the European Union would fundamentally transform Ukraine. It would require a cure for Ukrainian corruption. It would require a more democratic system. It would require decent treatment of minorities by Ukraine, including the Russian minority, and it would produce a more pacifist Ukraine. So why not? Why object to that? But the second reason is, I think the Russians very realistically judge that there's very little prospect that the European Union, in fact, would welcome Ukraine. The French, in particular, see Ukraine as destroying their agricultural policy, which is always a matter of controversy in French politics. Ukraine has the best agricultural land in Europe, or maybe in Eurasia. And there are other issues. Poland and Ukraine have a historically very strained relationship, having to do with the murder of Poles. So this is not a history that endears Ukrainians to Poles. And Poland also is harboring a couple of million Ukrainian refugees who probably never are going back to Ukraine. So this is a problem too. So first issue is neutrality for Ukraine, no NATO membership. Second is the rights of minorities, including Hungarian and Romanian minorities in Ukraine. And the third issue, which is the largest one, is some sort of re-engineering of the structure of security arrangements in Europe. The Munich conference would be an appropriate place to make such a proposal. In fact, in 2007, Vladimir Putin used the Munich conference to make a proposal which was not taken under advisement by the West. But Russia wants peace in Europe, and it wants guarantees against threats from the West. And the West, of course, should want guarantees against threats from Russia. But that discussion has been ruled out of order by the West from the beginning, and it's part of the reason we have a war in Ukraine. So what will Mr. General Kellogg say? We'll see. There's been no preview of what that might be that is in any way responsive to the Russian agenda. So untangling the Ukraine war is going to be very complicated. I hope General Kellogg has a viable proposal for doing that. But I'm sure I'm sure the Russians are going to drive a very, very hard bargain because they have all the leverage. The military situation favors them. There may be a movement or two from time to time by the Ukrainians to question that, but Ukraine is falling back and the Russians are advancing. And if the war goes on, Ukraine will lose still more territory, possibly even Odessa and its entire Black Sea coast, leaving it landlocked and much reduced in territory, as well as, I should say, Ukraine's heavy industry was in the Donetsk eastern part of Ukraine. Its best agricultural land is also in the east. And so Ukraine deprived of these territories, it seems likely now, would be a much impoverished Ukraine. Ukraine's already the poorest country in Europe. I don't think that says anything very much about the European Union as a whole. And you're quite right to point to the political instability in Germany, the deindustrialization of the German economy, the pain that this is inflicting on Germany, the increased dependence of Germany on energy imports from the United States in particular, because Germany, unlike France, which is heavily nuclear in its power supply and therefore somewhat immune to foreign dependence, depends heavily on natural gas and oil, which must be imported. So we have an election coming up in Germany very shortly, and we will see what that produces. It's quite confusing. There are differing evaluations of what's happening, but the German right, which favors some kind of more relaxed, restrained relationship with Russia, is a major factor in those elections. Well, the three Baltic states were, of course, illegally annexed by the Soviet Union during World War II. The Russian Tsar had earlier taken them over. They have a well-founded fear of a Russian aggression. One can't deny them the validity of that. They are the most anti-Russian of all Europeans because of this experience. They're backed up in that perhaps by the Finns. Finland, which is now part of NATO, experienced the loss of Karelia, part of Finland, to the Soviet Union in its war with the Soviet Union prior to World War II. So it's understandable why they might want to de-link themselves from dependence on Russia. They have suffered cyber attacks from Russia, in the case of Estonia in particular, and so they're seeking security by distancing themselves from Russia. All that's understandable. This is the classic NATO-centered conference on security in Europe, and has been so for many, many decades. I don't know that I would have chosen that as the venue to make an announcement about Ukraine. But then we do have indications that Mr. General Kellogg and Mr. Trump himself, again, characteristically see threats to Russia as the key to reaching an agreement with the Russians, as more sanctions and so forth. This is something the Russians have frankly laughed off because they're under so many sanctions already that they have so little economic interaction with the United States and others that it's in the West that the threat is really quite hollow. But I note that the Russians have recently been saying through their press spokespeople, look, we're waiting for an American proposal. Of course, one of the strangest things or most objectionable aspects of this appearance of Mr. Netanyahu at the White House is that, as someone said, here is a convicted felon receiving a fugitive from justice, someone charged with war crimes. This is a repudiation of international law and order on a level that would have previously been unimaginable. So there's no evidence of any concern on Mr. Trump's part about international opinion at all on any subject. He came into office and immediately raised a series of issues on mostly spurious grounds, charging that the Panama Canal is operated by the Chinese military, which is absolutely not true, and demanding the return of the canal to the United States, which left the canal which ended its joint management of the canal in 1990. He demanded that Denmark, an American ally and member of NATO, turn over Greenland to the United States. So he's basically in defiance of the United Nations, of international laws and conventions, of international opinion. And here again, I would say, if you look at any vote in the United Nations General Assembly on the question of Palestinian self-determination, you'll find that even American allies support it, at least rhetorically, even if they don't seem to be willing to do anything effective to promote it. Of course, China and Russia are reflecting judgments of the United Nations Security Council in repeated resolutions affirming the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, affirming the requirement for Israel to withdraw from the territories it conquered in 1967 and end the occupation. They are also conforming to the judgments of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Even the UAE, which had joined the Abraham Accords at Cairo, where a contact group met, 6 countries, joined in a denunciation of Mr. Trump's proposal and opposition to it. Usually the Saudis are very careful and cautious and a bit mealy-mouthed in their statements. This was absolutely forthright. There will be no normalization with Israel until there is a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem, which is not in prospect. So this means there's no normalization. So what Mr. Trump has done is drive a wedge between the United States and the Gulf Arabs. Of course, one already exists between the United States and Iran. But I think more broadly, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, all 57 members, including Turkey, which has also denounced this proposal, are now opposed to American activities in the Middle East. So we have lost whatever support we had for and whatever credibility we had on this issue. And in the case of Gaza, well, he made 2 comments. One was with regard to Gaza that once it was emptied, it would be redeveloped and turned over to the United States, which I find rather preposterous. But anyway, that's what he said. And the Palestinians would be resettled somewhere nice. And the latest word is that since both Egypt and Jordan, as well as Indonesia, have turned down any resettlement of Palestinians, his people have been looking at Somaliland, Puntland in Somalia, 2 unrecognized self-declared independent regimes as a place to resettle the Palestinians, or alternatively in Morocco, presumably in return for a huge payment of some sort. But anyway, that's what we know about that. The problem is, of course, that increasing the pain simply feeds into the right wing in Iran on their efforts to persuade, to authorize the construction of a nuclear weapon. It is totally counterproductive. This is not how you open a relationship with an adversary. The better model, of course, is the example of Anwar Sadat flying to Jerusalem in a grand gesture intended to establish a relationship with Israel that was conciliatory, or Richard Nixon flying to Beijing to enlist China in the containment of the Soviet Union in 1972. Mr. Trump's technique is like this. this is how he does every negotiation. Well, we have to start by recognizing that American public opinion, at least in the American media, have taken no notice of the fact that there was a change of leadership in Iran. Mr. Pezeshkian, the prime minister, is not a radical conservative, reactionary. Quite the contrary, he's moderate. He attempted to reach out to the West. They continue to call the regime in Tehran, the government in Tehran, radical, reactionary, Islamist, anti-American, anti-Western, so forth. And of course, they treat Iran that way. So the second point, however, is that Mr. Trump's negotiating style typically is that of a New York gangster. That is, he starts off with a threat to destroy everything. He did this, if you recall, with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, threatening fire and destruction in North Korea. But then he turned around and tried to negotiate with Kim Jong-un to find a basis for coexistence with the North Korean regime. That was sabotaged by some of the people in his entourage at the time, notably John Bolton. But it was a sincere effort, I believe. So he may well be thinking about reaching out to Iran in another round of negotiations and raising the level of pain on Iran in order to increase in his view, the incentive for Iran to make concessions. I think the Iranian policies would be probably moderated if there were a normalization of relations with the United States and the West. Now, when the JCPOA was negotiated, there was no offer of that sort on the table. That is to say, the negotiation was purely about the nuclear program and sanctions relief. And there was no implication that the United States and Iran would do what Saudi Arabia and Iran have subsequently done, namely establish a relatively normal relationship on which they could build cooperation. So I think at the moment one has to be pessimistic about the prospects. But you're absolutely right. There's an ironic benefit for Israel in a more peaceful approach to Iran. And we should remember that Israel, for many years, did have a constructive relationship with Iran because they had common enemies in the Arab world. And this was evident as late as the 1980s during the Iran-Contra affair, when Israel was supplying weapons to Iran. So the old adage that there are permanent interests for countries but no permanent friends or enemies does very much apply in the Middle East. The other thing Mr. Trump said, which was somewhat obscured because of the furor about Gaza, was that he would consider the Israeli annexation of the West Bank, which, quote, some people think is a good idea, unquote, he said, and make a decision in 4 weeks. Well, this goes back to the alleged payment of payoff by Mrs. Adelson for just that. So I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that all of this is premised on the return of the Israeli armed forces to the war of annihilation and the extension of that, not just to Gaza, but to the West Bank. But the clear statement is about Gaza by him is entirely consistent with what Mr. Netanyahu has claimed, namely that he had assurances from Mr. Trump, as Mr. Trump came into the presidency, that he, Netanyahu, could restart the war of annihilation on the Palestinians at any moment of his choosing. It looks to me as though he's positioned himself that way with Mr. Netanyahu, and he doesn't seem to want a war with Iran. And there, just to return briefly to that subject, I think it was very significant, perhaps, that he thinks there are only 1.7 million Palestinians left to be moved out of Gaza. Now, you have to be very careful with any statement of fact that Mr. Trump makes, because he is habitually wrong, or actually, in many cases, simply lies. So we don't know whether that reflects a serious judgment or not, but it is suggestive of the much higher numbers of deaths in Gaza that those who have studied Gaza, like the Lancet, the medical journal in Britain, which is a global leader in the field, have concluded. So this is an interesting statement, I think. So this has been a very consistent stand, and I would remind you that when Mr. Trump was in office the first time, he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, contrary to many international legal decisions, which left it to be an international city first, and then envisaged it as a divided city with the capital of the Palestinian state in East Jerusalem. He recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. We have heard that in the campaign, his campaign for office this time, Miriam Adelson, the widow of the late casino owner, who once said that he was ashamed that he had worn an American Army uniform rather than an Israeli Army uniform, very clear that he had no divided loyalty. He was loyal to Israel rather than the United States. She gave him apparently $100 million in return for a pledge to permit the annexation of the West Bank by Israel and the ethnic cleansing everywhere. First of all, it's pretty clear that Mr. Trump, when he was speaking to this subject, was reading off cards that had been written for him, talking points. The widespread suspicion is that those were written by Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who's always had his eye on real estate development in Gaza, and who basically constructed the Abraham Accords, the so-called Abraham Accords, between UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, with Morocco and Sudan also somewhat less involved, precisely in order to sideline the Palestinian issue, take it off the table, and proceed to make Israel acceptable in its region without dealing with the Palestinian issue in the only way that can address that issue, which is self-determination. So I agree with you. There are these two ways of speaking or speculating about what Mr. Trump is up to, but I don't have any doubt at all that he's just trying to help Mr. Netanyahu complete the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that the Zionist movement has always wanted to carry out. I noted that when he signed his executive order decreeing that the policy of maximum pressure on Iran should be imposed or reimposed, that he said he did so with great reluctance. He also said something very interesting. He said Iran has not built a bomb and doesn't have a bomb program, which is consistent with the judgment of intelligence agencies everywhere, but not consistent with political opinion and the official narrative embraced by the Republican Party and indeed the Congress in general, as well as Israeli politicians. So he seemed to be positioning himself to bargain with Iran, and this is a reminder that during his when he repudiated the so-called JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, he said he was doing so in order to negotiate a better deal. Even the UAE, which had joined the Abraham Accords at Cairo, where a contact group met, 6 countries, joined in the denunciation of Mr. Trump's proposal and opposition to it. Usually the Saudis are very careful and cautious and a bit mealy-mouthed in their statements. This was absolutely forthright. There will be no normalization with Israel until there is a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem, which is not in prospect. So this means there's no normalization. So what Mr. Trump has done is drive a wedge between the United States and the Gulf Arabs. Of course, one already exists between the United States and Iran. But I think more broadly, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, all 57 members, including Turkey, which has also denounced this proposal, are now opposed to American activities in the Middle East. So we have lost whatever support we had for, and whatever credibility we had on this issue. And in the case of Gaza, well, he made two comments. One was with regard to Gaza, that once it was emptied, it would be redeveloped and turned over to the United States, which I find rather preposterous. But anyway, that's what he said. And the Palestinians would be resettled somewhere nice. And the latest word is that since both Egypt and Jordan, as well as Indonesia, have turned down any resettlement of Palestinians, his people have been looking at Somaliland, Puntland in Somalia, two unrecognized self-declared independent regimes as a place to resettle the Palestinians, or alternatively in Morocco, presumably in return for a huge payment of some sort. But anyway, that's what we know about that.